May 12, 1944, west of Koblenz. The contrails were already beginning to tear apart in the upper air when the American fighters moved ahead of the bombers. They were not sitting neatly on the bomber wings. They were not tied close to the silver formations grinding toward Germany in disciplined boxes. They were spread out, unevenly, across the sky in a wide forward screen, P-47 Thunderbolts with full fuel tanks, heavy engines, and pilots trying to read a battlefield that was wider than any single cockpit could hold. To the German controllers on the ground, the raid was still intelligible. Bombers were coming. The bombers had to be broken before they reached the target. Fighters had to be assembled, climbed, vectored, and thrown into the stream at the right moment. It was a system the Luftwaffe still understood, because for much of the war, the defending fighter arm had lived by timing, altitude, nerve, and the killing skill of men who had survived longer than almost anyone else in the air. Then the Americans began appearing in the wrong places, not just beside the bombers, ahead of them, above the expected interception points, across the routes German fighters used to gather themselves before attack. It looked wasteful, even careless. A fighter escort that abandoned the bombers seemed to invite disaster. But that was the point that made the tactics so difficult to understand at first. The Americans were no longer trying simply to shield the bomber stream like a moving wall. They were trying to reach into the Luftwaffe's defensive machinery before that machinery could complete its work. If you value this kind of battlefield reconstruction, stay with the story, because the important part is not that the tactic worked immediately. The important part is that at first contact, it nearly failed. Hubert Zemke's element had begun the day as 4 P-47. One aircraft aborted, leaving 3 Thunderbolts pushing through hostile air, separated from the security of mass. The P-47 was a powerful machine, fast in a dive and brutally strong, but it was not elegant in the way pilots imagined elegance. It was broad, heavy, thick-winged, with a radial engine that made the nose look almost industrial. German pilots had already learned not to underestimate it. Still, 3 isolated Thunderbolts were not a formation the Luftwaffe had reason to fear. Above them, Major Günther Rall was hunting. Rall was not an amateur defending Germany with slogans and hope. He had fought from France to Russia and back into the Reich's own airspace. He had accumulated victories in numbers almost unimaginable to Allied pilots. His experience had been forged in a different kind of air war, where the expert who saw first, positioned first, and fired first could decide the fight before his opponent understood he was in one. Against 3 P-47, his assumptions were reasonable. The Bf-109 came in with altitude and purpose. The first attack cut through the American circle with the economy of a pilot who understood deflection, timing, and the small fatal geometry of aerial combat. 1 Thunderbolt went down. Moments later, another was hit. Zemke was left almost alone, trying to survive in a sky where the first test of his new method had turned into an ambush by one of the most dangerous fighter pilots alive. This was the contradiction hidden inside the American tactic. It was not designed to produce heroic single combats. It was designed to make single combats matter less. But before that larger logic could reveal itself, men still had to survive the immediate seconds when an expert appeared out of the sun. Zemke escaped by using the P-47 in the way it could be trusted. Nose down, power on, into a violent rolling dive that used weight and speed as protection. The Thunderbolt could absorb punishment and build velocity quickly. It was not graceful. It did not need to be. It needed to get its pilot out of a collapsing situation with enough altitude and engine left to rejoin the fight. Below and ahead, the larger raid was still moving. Bombers crossed Germany with their contrails dragging behind them, their crews watching flak rise in dark bursts and searching the sky for the shape every crew feared, a German fighter turning in for a pass before the escort could reach it. For the men and the bombers, doctrine was not abstract. It was the spacing between aircraft, the discipline of holding formation, the hope that friendly fighters would appear before enemy fighters found the correct angle. For the Luftwaffe, the problem was becoming more complicated by the month. In 1943, German fighter defenses had inflicted terrible losses on unescorted American bombers. The combat box had given B-17 and B-24 overlapping fields of machine gun fire, but a box was still a formation of heavy aircraft flying deep into enemy-controlled air. It could punish attackers. It could not chase them. It could not prevent fighters from gathering beyond gun range, climbing into position, and choosing the direction of the attack. The German answer had evolved with brutal competence. Fighters attacked head-on where bomber guns were fewer and closing speeds were high. Heavier aircraft, including cannon-armed FW-190 and twin-engine destroyers, were used where they could be protected. Controllers tried to concentrate interceptors against the bomber stream before it passed the target. The system was strained, but it was still dangerous, because it did not require the Luftwaffe to win everywhere. It only needed moments of concentration. The Americans began to understand that close escort alone was not enough. A fighter sitting obediently beside a bomber was useful, but it was also reactive. It waited for the German attack to arrive. By the time German fighters appeared near the bombers, many of the defenders' decisions had already been made. The Luftwaffe had climbed. It had assembled. Its leaders had selected the target formation. Its pilots had begun the attack run. The escort could intervene, but it was arriving late inside the enemy's process. The ugly American answer was to stop treating the bomber stream as the only place where the battle existed. Zemke's fan took fighters and spread them forward in a broad searching formation, not as a parade ground escort, but as a hunting screen. The idea was simple enough to look crude. Push fighters ahead of the bombers, fan them across likely interception routes, find German fighters while they were still climbing, forming, or waiting for instructions. Break them up before they could become a coordinated attack. It lacked the visual satisfaction of tight escort. It created gaps. It demanded discipline without the comfort of proximity. A pilot might look left and right and see empty sky where, under older doctrine, friendly aircraft should have been close enough to reassure him. On a map, the concept made sense. Inside a cockpit over Germany, it could feel like being sent too far forward with too few friends. That was why the May 12th encounter mattered. It showed the danger honestly. Rall's attack proved that the Luftwaffe's best pilots could still exploit isolation. Experience had not vanished. German marksmanship had not become obsolete. The Bf-109 remained deadly in the hands of someone who knew how to use altitude, speed, and surprise. The old fighter war could still reappear suddenly, personally, and violently, but then the rest of the American system began to arrive. Other P-47 entered the fight. The German formation that had expected to strike the bomber stream now found American fighters appearing around its edges. Rall shot down 2 Thunderbolts that day, but he was then hit by .50 caliber fire from another P-47. Rounds tore through his cockpit, damaged his aircraft, and wounded his left hand. He bailed out and survived, but he was removed from combat for months. The most important evidence from that day was not a victory claim on a board. It was a damaged glove. Years later, Rall's torn flying glove would become an artifact because it captured something larger than a duel. A leading Luftwaffe ace had entered the air battle with the skill to kill. He had done exactly that, yet the American tactic did not require him to be inferior. It only required that even a pilot like Rall could not be everywhere at once, could not protect every inexperienced wingman, could not complete the interception if the formation around him was being pulled apart before it reached the bombers. That was the hidden weakness beneath the Luftwaffe's apparent strength. Germany still possessed extraordinary fighter pilots. Some had combat records built across hundreds of missions. They had instincts sharpened by survival and by a system that rewarded individual lethality. But by 1944, the air war over Germany was no longer a contest that elite individuals could solve by being exceptional. The scale had changed. The Americans were not sending a few formations into contested air and hoping courage would carry them through. They were building a sustained operational machine. Bombers in mass, escorts in relays, drop tanks extending range, training pipelines producing pilots with standardized methods, ground crews turning aircraft around, and commanders willing to change the rules when older assumptions became too expensive. The Luftwaffe's ace culture had once made sense. In the opening years of the war, German pilots often fought from positions of operational advantage. They attacked enemies with weaker coordination, poorer readiness, or outdated doctrine. On the Eastern Front, many experten built huge victory totals in conditions of relentless combat and uneven opposition, though at appalling strain. Their skill was real. Their confidence was earned. But defending the Reich against the 8th Air Force was different. The German fighter pilot now had to climb into a sky crowded with enemies, find the bombers, avoid escort fighters that no longer stayed politely tied to the formation, attack through defensive fire, evade pursuit, conserve fuel, and land at airfields increasingly vulnerable to strafing and bombing. Aces could still kill in moments, but the operation they served was being disrupted before the moment of attack even arrived. The Americans had learned through failure. The raids on Schweinfurt and Regensburg had shown the limits of daylight bombing without adequate escort. Crews had watched formations unravel under concentrated fighter attacks. Aircraft returned with engines out, control surfaces shredded, and empty positions where other bombers had been. The old belief that heavily armed bombers could always fight their way through had not survived contact with determined German interceptors. So the system changed. Long-range P-51 Mustangs entered the fight in growing numbers. P-47 and P-38 extended their reach with external tanks. Fighter control improved. Escorts were layered along the bomber route, taking over as fuel limits forced earlier groups to turn back. Most importantly, the mission of the fighter pilot shifted. Under commanders such as Jimmy Doolittle, the first duty of the escorts was no longer understood as simply staying close to the bombers. Their first duty was to destroy German fighters. That sentence changed the shape of the air war. It meant the bombers were not only targets to be protected, they were also bait that forced the Luftwaffe into the air. This was not a comfortable idea. It was operationally harsh, and bomber crews understood the cost in the most personal way possible. But from the American command perspective, destroying factories was not enough if the Luftwaffe remained able to contest the skies over France before the coming invasion. German fighters had to be drawn up, found, and worn down. The fan tactic belonged to that larger change. It was ugly because it violated the older emotional image of escort. Loyal fighters close beside the bombers, visible to the crews, reassuring in the thin air. Instead, American fighters began ranging outward into the spaces where German pilots expected to prepare unmolested. They appeared above assembly points, near airfields, along approach corridors, and ahead of the bomber stream. They forced German formations to turn early, break formation, jettison tanks, or fight before they had chosen the terms. For a Luftwaffe pilot, this changed the rhythm of interception. Before, the problem was to penetrate the bomber defense. Now the problem began earlier. Climbing toward altitude, a German pilot might see flashes of American fighters crossing his path before the bombers were even in sight. A controller's vector could become obsolete within minutes. A group trying to assemble could be split by Thunderbolts diving from above. FW-190 is equipped for bomber killing, could be caught before they reached the heavies. Twin-engine fighters, dangerous against bombers but vulnerable to escorts, became increasingly difficult to use in daylight. The expected result failed to occur. The Luftwaffe expected American fighters to be near the bombers. Instead, they were ahead. It expected to decide when to engage. Instead, it was being engaged while still organizing. It expected its best pilots to create openings. Instead, those pilots were pulled into scattered fights that consumed time, altitude, fuel, and attention. This did not make the German fighter arm harmless. It made its main task harder to complete. There is a difference. The Luftwaffe could still shoot down American aircraft. It could still punish mistakes. It could still use weather, cloud, altitude, and local concentration. But the margin was shrinking. Every interception that began too early, every formation that broke before reaching the bombers, every experienced pilot wounded or lost, every green replacement forced into combat with too few hours, moved the defense closer to exhaustion. By the spring of 1944, that exhaustion was visible in small physical details. Airfields with aircraft dispersed along tree lines, mechanics working under pressure with shortages that could not be solved by skill. young pilots climbing into fighters without the training time their predecessors had received. Veterans trying to lead formations whose weakest members could barely survive the first minutes of contact. Fuel becoming not just a supply problem, but a training problem, because an Air Force short of fuel cannot properly teach new pilots how to fight. Against that background, the American system did not need to produce better aces than Germany. It needed to produce enough competent pilots, flying enough aircraft, under a doctrine that increasingly punished the Luftwaffe for showing up. This is where the title's reversal becomes clear. The Luftwaffe's top aces were not helpless because they forgot how to fly. They were helpless because the battle they were being asked to win had moved beyond the reach of individual mastery. A man like Rall could enter a fight and shoot down 2 P-47. That was still possible. But he could not stop the bomber stream, protect the fuel industry, preserve his group, train replacements, and defeat the escorts spreading across Germany's approaches. The Fan did not defeat him in a fair duel. It made the duel less decisive. That was the American achievement. On May 12th, the raid itself struck into one of Germany's most sensitive vulnerabilities: fuel. American bombers and fighters attacked refineries and synthetic fuel targets, the industrial bloodstream of German mobility. The Luftwaffe rose to defend them because it had to. To ignore such attacks was to accept strangulation. But to rise was to expose itself to the widening American fighter net. The sky became a trap built from operational necessity. German fighters had to climb. American fighters were waiting farther out than expected. German pilots had to form up. American fighters interrupted the formation. German aces had to lead. American numbers and tactics forced them into repeated engagements, where even success consumed irreplaceable experience. The old assumptions still produced moments of brilliance. They no longer produced strategic recovery. This was not clean. It was not immediate. American losses remained serious. Bomber crews still endured flak, fighters, mechanical failure, weather, and a fear of long minutes over the target. Escort pilots still misread contacts, lost formations, ran short of fuel, and sometimes found themselves alone above enemy territory. The Fan could scatter strength as well as project it. When timing failed, gaps opened. When communication faltered, pilots searched empty sky while the fight developed somewhere else. But adaptation does not require perfection. It requires learning faster than the opponent can repair the damage. The Luftwaffe tried to adapt. It changed formations, used heavily armed interceptors, coordinated with flak belts, and sought moments when weather or routing reduced American escort effectiveness. Its commanders understood the danger. Many German pilots knew perfectly well that the growing American fighter presence was changing the air war. They were not fools. They were professionals inside a system running out of time, fuel, trained men, and strategic flexibility. The Americans, meanwhile, could refine. A tactic that looked ragged on its first dangerous trial became part of a broader offensive escort philosophy. Fighter groups ranged ahead. Others covered the bomber stream. Still others swept withdrawal routes or attacked airfields when opportunities appeared. The escort was no longer a shield held close to the body. It was a moving set of blades, pushed outward to cut into the enemy's ability to strike. By the time German pilots reached the bombers, if they reached them at all, many had already fought once. That mattered. A fighter that had jettisoned altitude in an earlier engagement could not attack the bomber stream as planned. A formation that had lost cohesion could not deliver the same concentrated blow. A pilot watching for Mustangs above him could not focus entirely on the bombers ahead. A commander trying to gather scattered elements over radio channels filled with pressure and interruption could not restore the clean geometry the interception required. The battlefield no longer rewarded the older instinct in the same way. The ace still wanted the advantageous pass, the isolated target, the quick kill, the exit into cloud or altitude. But the Americans were making isolation harder to find and escape harder to guarantee. They were crowding the decision cycle. They were forcing the Luftwaffe to react before it was ready. That is what helplessness looked like in 1944. Not panic, not incompetence, not sudden collapse, but the steady loss of initiative by men who could still fight well. A German pilot might take off believing he understood the mission. Climb to altitude. Join the formation. Receive vectors. Attack the bomber stream. Break away. Land. Repeat if fuel and aircraft allowed. Then, before the bomber formation appeared, the sky ahead would move. Small black shapes against glare. Drop tanks falling away. Thunderbolts or Mustangs turning in from above. Radio calls tightening. A formation opening when it needed to close. The interception timetable breaking apart by seconds, then minutes, then by the entire logic of the mission. The bombers continued on. That was the quiet cruelty of the tactic. It did not always need to destroy every German fighter. Sometimes it only had to delay them, scatter them, pull them down, or make them spend their attack against escorts instead of bombers. A failed interception could leave fewer wrecks than a dramatic dogfight, but operationally it could matter more. The target was still struck, the fuel plant still burned, the Luftwaffe still lost time it did not have. By the summer of 1944, the consequences were spreading beyond any single engagement. Allied air superiority over Western Europe became not just an aspiration, but an accumulating fact. German fighter units were increasingly forced into defensive reactions under conditions they did not control. The coming invasion of Normandy would depend on more than fighters, but the weakening of the Luftwaffe was essential to the larger Allied plan. Airfields, rail lines, fuel, bridges, and troop movements would all be exposed to a degree that would have been impossible if German fighter strength had remained intact. The fan tactic was one piece of that pressure system. It was not magic. It did not replace aircraft production, pilot training, intelligence, logistics, or the range of the Mustang. But it expressed the deeper transformation better than any polished diagram could. The Americans had stopped thinking of escort as a passive duty. They had turned it into an offensive operation. For the Luftwaffe's top aces, that was the unacceptable change. They had been raised by a war in which the gifted hunter could bend local reality through skill. By 1944, the air over Germany was being shaped by mass coordination. The hunter was still dangerous, but now he was hunting inside someone else's machine. May 12th ended with losses on both sides, damaged aircraft, missing crews, and claims that only partially conveyed what had happened. The numbers mattered, but the pattern mattered more. Rall survived, wounded and removed from the fight. Zemke survived, shaken by how close the new method had come to disaster. The American bombers continued to strike at fuel, aircraft, and the industrial foundations of German resistance. The fighter escorts kept pushing outward. The tactic that had looked too loose, too risky, too ugly, had revealed its purpose. It did not make war in the air cleaner. It made it more systematic. It attacked not only German aircraft, but German timing. Not only pilots, but formation. Not only courage, but the process by which courage became an interception. That was why the Luftwaffe's aces could still win fights and lose the air war around them. The older doctrine had not been foolish. It had belonged to an earlier balance of conditions. But the conditions changed faster than Germany could replace what the new battle consumed. Experience alone was no longer enough. Skill alone was no longer enough. Even brilliance, appearing suddenly above 3 isolated Thunderbolts, could not restore a system being pulled apart across hundreds of miles of sky. In the end, the ugly tactic was ugly only if war was imagined as a duel. Seen from the operational map, it was something else. A recognition that modern air combat was becoming less about the single perfect attack and more about denying the enemy the chance to make one. And by then, over Germany, the chance was disappearing. If this story changed how you see the air war, share your thoughts below and keep the memory of these crews, on both sides of the sky, in the conversation.